Hello, this presentation is titled, But Wait, There's More, Case Studies to Promote Belief Change. My name is Christopher Willard, and one of the courses I teach is called Global Perspectives. It's a course mainly for second-year students, although students at all undergraduate levels may take it as an elective. The goal that I have in this course is for students to look at art around the world and then to challenge and shake up students' knowledge of systems and structures that affect those worlds. My secret agenda for students in this course is what I would call belief change. Belief change is known to be notoriously difficult in classrooms. I found that case studies are one of the more successful ways to effect belief reevaluation and potential belief change. Over the course of this presentation, we will look at two case studies defined as scenarios, imaginary or real, that elicit both intuitive and reasoned responses from students. Case studies are focused on active learning and inquiry-based learning in a social environment where, as such, they are also intended to foster viewpoint diversity and inclusivity. Best practices are enhanced and supported by research. Case studies typically allow students to explore different perspectives and shared social meanings. Through inquiry-based learning, students engage with authentic pedagogy and assessments, authentic intellectual work, and interactive instruction. Through problem-based learning, students are supported in flexible problem solving, reasoning skills, and generating accurate hypotheses and coherent explanations. Okay, rather than deal with a lot of theory at this point, let's jump right into a case study. Basically, our situation is as follows. We have a student or an artist named Jane who has never traveled beyond her city, and she reads an article on the internet about people suffering from food scarcity in South Sudan. Feeling empathy, Jane decides to create a work of art about the subject. Okay, here's the painting that Jane created. She shows her painting to her friend, She, who says that Jane is talented, but wonders about Jane using the image that she found on the internet. Supporting documents included in the case study offer different opinions, suggesting that Jane should be able to paint anything she wants, or that Jane, as a white artist, should not appropriate imagery of a Southern Sudanese child to be depicted in a stereotypical manner. At the end of this presentation, you can find a narrative and supporting documents for this case study. The next step is for students in the classroom to arrange themselves into small groups. I typically find about 6 students in a group works really well. I ask them to move their chairs, to physically create a circle, or to gather around tables. And then I ask that each group choose a reporter. This is someone who will take notes. And it's also the reporter's job to call on people in the group to say, hey, I've not heard of you talking much. I would like to hear from you. Or, by the way, you've offered your opinion a lot. I'm wondering if you could pause for a second so we could ask someone else if they can offer their opinion. I also find that if I give out paper handouts of the case study, students appreciate that because they can refer to it as they're talking with others. Once they're in the small groups, I remind students of the question we're discussing. So here we have an artist who created a painting, and some of the things we might ask the students to discuss are, do you think there are any issues around this artist creating this painting? Does anything arise for you? So in a sense, I'm keeping it sort of vague to see where students are at with their thinking about issues that might arise. And then I might say, okay, great, let's start discussing. As students discuss our role as instructor, is to listen in but not add to the discussion. We may find that at some point a student raises their hand and says, we are not coming to a consensus around an issue, and we can remind everyone there's no need for consensus with any opinion or decision. All right, students are discussing. Let's pause here a moment to consider some of the outcomes of case studies in more detail. The benefits of case studies include less of the sage on the stage instructor up front and more students leading discussion. The dynamics of a top-down classroom have been subverted. Students bring in diverse viewpoints and knowledge bases to the discussion. Students practice interpersonal relations. And as reporters, students learn to facilitate discussions. As a qualitative method, case studies facilitate students in engaging with or grappling with ambiguity. In this sense, a case study is a form of philosophical thought experiment. It sets up a dilemma without a clear answer. Negotiating and reconciling different viewpoints. Privileging inclusion and intersubjectivity. Testing of ideas and opinions on a group stage. Recognizing the case study does not support simple polarities, such as right and wrong, left or right. Respecting viewpoints that may challenge a student's beliefs, reflecting upon or questioning personal biases and presuppositions. Tidwell wrote about case studies. When we as merely mortal and fallible creatures enter our philosophical spaceship of objectivity and go whizzing up and over the world as we know it, the first thing we should realize is that we are viewing the world as we know it. Our subjectivity cannot be completely shed any more than our skin. Whatever objective aspirations we have are forever and always hemmed in by our subjective limitations. So everyone comes with a very strong opinion, with a knowledge base, etc., that they bring to the discussion. In a sense, there is no point from nowhere. There is no completely neutral position, no matter how hard we try. As students are discussing, we may want to remind them of this at some point. So in a case study, students will start by thinking from their personal knowledge bases, what they already know, what they've experienced. They might offer intuitive responses. And as they work as a group, they move toward deeper layered responses. So in terms of the painting we saw, students may first think about the quality of the painting. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it well drawn? They might question whether the artist did enough research about the subject. They might wonder, is it appropriate for an artist to, appropriate an image just to use in this way? And then as they work through this, ideas may lead into deeper questions around racialization of the subject and appropriation of an image of a child from the global South by a privileged member of the global North. They may bring in the concept of white knight, a term for a paternalistic assumption that well-meaning people know what's best for people of color. This is something I find that students today are often learning in high school. At times, a student may mischaracterize or not see the full picture. In groups, this may actually be self-correcting. What someone says that seems to be wrong, another student might say, well, let's look at it from this side, or I have a different opinion. And so we see that self-correcting strategy in play. And if not, the instructor can often jump in and offer a more focusing question to help guide students back to the main issue. The role of the instructor is always, I would say, to facilitate students moving toward a deeper investigation of the issues involved. What are considered, quote, answers, unquote, can be further problematized so they remain unresolved or provisional. Students' prior knowledge may not be particularly fitting. Simultaneously, students may be uncomfortable with the new viewpoints and ideas that arise. As students continue, we may find that the discussion deepens. They may begin to speak about the ethics of cultural appropriation, the use of similar images in advertisements for charitable organizations asking for donations of money. They may land on, or they may try to land on solid ground by suggesting the student would be okay if she had done much more research in addition to the painting. They may begin to focus on ideas of identity related to worldviews. And so as they discuss, we're watching. And over time, we find that students begin to start traversing the same area. They're not getting much deeper in their conversation. And this is leading us to start thinking about wrapping up the case study. But we're going to pause for 1 second here and look at methodology. The case study is interesting because it draws upon ideas found in both reflexive methodology, in that it supports perceptual, cultural, social constructivism, and the interpretive. And it also loosely utilizes aspects of grounded theory focused on theory that is derived from data systematically gathered and analyzed through the research process. And it allows for the creation of conceptual frameworks through inductive analysis of data. We can back up just for a second and look at the history of a case study, right? Which goes all the way back to George Lichtenberg, and you can come back and read that if you want. But the interesting part here about the narrative and supporting documents of a case study is everything helps frame, quote, what is at stake, unquote. We're putting in boundaries of the conversation for students to help them focus on what we might call the essential questions. We could say this is a biased structure, but I would argue that in any course, in any learning design, in any content emphasis, that we find an inherent bias anyway. And so learning works that way. And I don't think we need to really worry about accounting for that. Setting up a course, setting up an emphasis is part of a course, setting up the content within this is part of, in a sense, a bias. So I see that as a positive. A case study as a thought experiment reminds us, if we go back in time, of this thing called the trolley problem imagined by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967. A runaway trolley heads toward 5 people on a track, and we're there with the lever. Do we pull the lever to change the track so the trolley diverts and kills only 1 worker instead of 5? Very complex problem, unanswerable in a sense. People suggest answers and then they're disputed, et cetera, and there are many variations on this. All right, our students are wrapping up. We're seeing they're winding down. So now we're going to give them a 1 or 2 minute warning. We'll say, okay, we're going to come back to the big group in a minute. Let's wrap up our conversation. They will be ready to share their findings with the large group. And as we do that, we're going to lead some of the discussion by saying, okay, could you tell us some of the important things about this painting or about this artist creating this painting? And we'll start with the simple and we'll sort of work through toward the more complex. And I tend to jump around through the different groups, asking for 1 or 2 quick comments around these issues as we move forward. Obviously, if we're going to undertake a case study, we, as the instructor, have done our work. We've prepared, we've read the articles, which may be important. We are predicting some of the issues which are going to arise as students work through this. So in this particular case study of the artist appropriating the image, we're probably going to arise at some point with the idea put forth by Gayatri Spivak, who said, who speaks for whom and why? And it's from one of her famous articles, and that's in the appendix. You can seek out if you're interested. We might also expect questions like, who has the voice and freedom to express what and where and when? Is someone speaking for someone else who may not have that agency to do so? Is this correct? Is it ethically correct? Is it right or wrong? Doors will open to considerations of intersubjectivity as truth possibly relative as system or about system and structures of inequity or racism and dominant narratives. And so our goal is not to cover everything in depth, but to really show there are roots of further investigation in these different areas and to help students feel empowered uh, in terms of the possibilities there. As students present their views, our goal, in a sense, we have a number of them. One is to facilitate open discussion. We want to model acceptance of viewpoint diversity. We want to support inclusive engagement via sharing. We want to support the validity of individual worldviews found both in majority and minority viewpoints. And we want to support the idea that discussions are not about coming to a final answer, but realizing that every issue is layered with perhaps many viewpoints in which no position is neutral. At a certain point, students will have stated and explored most of the main concepts. And they may say, well, I don't feel like we have any answer here, that our answers are contradictions or provisional. And we can reflect this, that with complex issues, as in life, there may be no final single answer. Part of what we're doing is figuring out where we, each of us, stand in relation to this issue, where our opinion sits, where our reasoned understanding, begins to open up the world for us. So in a sense, there's always going to be more, and I don't think this is a particularly bad thing. I think it's one of the benefits of a case study. As Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over. In a case study where I showed the example of the young woman in the painting, I might actually expand at the end of the discussion with a couple more examples to sort of, again, open the world up to the students and to bring in some tangential things. And Adrian Piper is an artist who often push the boundaries of acceptable social activities. In the image here, Piper is wearing a sign. It's with sticky paint, and Piper was going into Macy's department store to buy some things while wearing this sign. And Piper said, I was making my body public. I was turning myself into an object. Piper said she was uninterested in preserving the impact. She was interested in preserving the impact and uncategorized nature of the confrontation. Her actions tended to define the situation in terms of the pre-established categories of guerrilla theater or event or happening or street work, etc. So the goal again is to offer tangential and supplementary ideas and to expand aspects of the case study discussion. So here the artist could be said to appropriate and objectify the artist's own body, where it becomes a site of discourse, and it's easy for us and easy for students to relate that to what we've seen. Here's a famous picture educators have often used in their PowerPoints, and I have too. And two takeaways become evident here. The first is that all class participants bring diverse identities, knowledge bases, and experiences to bear on the discussion. And these are what philosopher Marcus Gabriel calls individual fields of sense, which we could also call epistemological pluralism, where everyone has their own field of sense, they see the world from their own position, and every one of those is different. The second takeaway, again, is there is no one final sure answer. Instead, we are confronted with potentialities and possibilities that are not simply two sides, but many sides, often contradictory, all of which are expanded by students' fields of sense. So our goal at all times, again, is not to shut down discourse with a normative answer, and it's not to confuse students with too many options. Rather, we want to reinforce the idea that part of an answer is taking a position, knowing that it may be provisional and knowing that it may not fit for everyone. Okay, so that's the end of our first case study. We'll take a slight brain break here. I'll take a sip of coffee. Some research has shown, and I tend to believe in this, that if we take a little we take a little brain break, that we are uh, giving our brain a rest. We're looking at a cartoon here, which is kind of humorous based on the trolley problem. We focus on something different. We have a little joke or whatever it is, and then we can begin to come back and focus again with sort of a renewed energy. A student in my class once said, leaving, in your classes, I always leave feeling like my head is ready to explode. And I said, well, great, I sort of intend that. And they looked at me a little funny, and I looked at them back a little funny, and we laughed, and that was great. I want to get students thinking. I want them to realize that the world is full of these unending discourses, in a sense, these layered discourses. Okay, let's move to our next case study, which I'll call a visual analysis. And the difference between the first case study and this case study is the first one opens up ideas with no real answer. And in this one, we're looking for more of an answer. So the case study is requiring students to create their own narrative, to use evidence in an inductive manner, to look very carefully, and to put this evidence together to create a hypothesis. So as we go through this, you can play that game too if you would like to. And so the question is, and with respect to that painting, art, work, whatever it is, first of all, I would ask students, what is this? Is it a painting? Is it a photo? Is it collage? Is it sculpture? Can you tell me what this is? And we won't deal with that today. I can very quickly tell you what it is since we're not focused there. It's titled Drain by Jeff Wall, a famous artist who poses these figures in a completely fabricated environment in the studio, takes hundreds, if not thousands of images, and then basically collages them digitally together to make this sort of seamless image. The great thing about Jeff Wall for me is there's always something that seems really strange about these images, and I can never quite put my finger on that. And that streams through all of Wall's work, and it's a real quality there. The second thing I would like students to think about, and this is where we'll focus, is what is this work about, actually? What's the idea that's being presented by the artist? So I'll show you this image, and I'll show you a detail of this image. And we can assume one thing about top-level serious artists. Everything they put in a work of art is a choice. Every decision, the lighting, the color, the composition, on and on, every single thing is a choice that supports their intended subject or their intended message. And so what we're looking for, we're kind of flipping that, saying, okay, we have the evidence, we need to figure out what that intended message is. So here's a detail which I think will help us see what's going on in the center of that image. And we see a couple of figures here and some water and this dark hole drain sort of thing. Students might say, well, it just shows two girls, or, oh, I'm not good at this. I'm not going to get very far. And this is where, again, the group dynamic helps to solve that problem. Students can rely on each other. They can call a friend, in a sense, to move past areas where they don't quite feel like they're up to speed or ready. And in fact, they all are. And that's part of our job, to think about presenting case studies that are level appropriate, et cetera. We can always say, gee, or I'll say to you, I'm sorry, you're involved in a case study now, and I believe you can figure this out. I believe you can look at this image and say, okay, I'm going to look at all the evidence and put it together. So here it is, and I'll say start, and feel free to pause and look at this image for as long as you want, and see if you can begin to put together what the pieces of evidence are that you need to form into that narrative or hypothesis. I'm going to continue here in the interest of the PowerPoint. When we come back to the big group, I'm going to start asking students, what is this? What media? And a lot of people do think it's painting or photo or just found, artist was driving around and shot it, et cetera. But then we move to the meat, which is what really is going on. And I want to point out one thing here that's very common with art. Students might say, this work is about water conservation. And we'll say, well, what in this image is giving you that impression? They'll say, well, there's water here and it's coming out of a drain. And then, of course, when we say, well, there's other evidence here, there are two figures that are standing on a rock or in the water. How do those figures fit to water conservation? Then the students start getting a bit stalled. They're not sure anymore. And we can point this out, say, well, part of what an artist is going to do is take all the evidence to add up to that one subject in a sense, not leave some of that evidence out. And in fact, if the artist had wanted to comment on water conservation, the artist certainly could have with much greater clarity than here. So now we start going around the room. And students are going to mention the facts of the matter in a sense. They'll say, yep, there are two girls. They're holding striking but different poses. The girl on the left looks younger. The girl on the right looks older. The older girl looks like she knows something. The younger girl does not. The younger girl looks fearful. The younger girl looks into the hole with perhaps trepidation. There is a dark hole in the middle of the work. The girls are standing on a rock and in the water. They are not simply onlookers. They're experiencing it. And we notice that on the lower left, there's some reddish rust or leaves there. And finally, we don't want to forget when we look at this, there is a title to it, and the artist always chooses the title, and that's called Drain. And there's our evidence mainly. There's a bit more because this painting relates to an early Cézanne painting, etc., but we don't need to get into that. But our question is, what does all of this evidence add up to? Now, all of you may have fairly extensive life experience and perspective, and you may think about this and say, you know, I'm getting an idea of what this is adding up to. It may take students a bit longer to, you know, they don't have the world experience, and to add all this up may be a little more difficult. They might also think in their own heads, a work of art is supposed to be about certain things and not other things. And so they may begin to have an idea and say, nah, their work's not about that, obviously. If students are really not getting this, they're really struggling, I might start offering some small sort of hints. I won't give anything away, but I might say, go through that evidence again, try to see it from a different view, share ideas, really see if you can figure this out. I might say, you know, you pointed out that one girl looks older and one younger, that the girl who looks older is kind of staring out at us, and she appears to be knowing something the younger girl doesn't know. What could that possibly be? So I'm emphasizing parts of the evidence rather than giving away any sort of answer. Any guesses? Well, at some point, a student or a group will say, could this be about that? Really? And yeah, the answer is, yeah, really, it is about that. And when that happens, it's like, ding, we see this light go on, and students are going, oh my gosh, yeah, this is about growing up and puberty, etc. And then, of course, are you willing to share your idea with the group? And the answer is usually yes, because it's a bit of a reward to be able to figure out something difficult, to come to that narrative in a sense. And this is not an easy one. This is a difficult one. So figuring it out becomes a reward for the hard work, that in a sense, there is an answer here as opposed to the first case study. And then other ideas emerge. This will open up too. Is this a form of appropriation? For example, should an artist identifying as a white male be able to make work with this subject? Can an artist comment on anything, use any subject, right? So we're coming back to questions raised by the first case study. If not, what are the boundaries? And if we demand boundaries, well, is that a form of censorship? And if we allow anything, are there any particular responsibilities for the artist doing the work. So like any case study, these are narrow issues that sort of fit the issue at hand, but they broaden out toward larger issues in the world that apply to a lot of things. Structurally, a case study, I think, mimics the Fichtean plot curve of a short story, meaning we have this crisis, we have this tension, it builds up to a climax, and at the height of tension, this is where we back off. We don't offer the resolution here. So in the first case study, we're not offering any resolution. We're saying, here's the tension, here's the debate. And if you read the narrative at the end, you'll see that the two artists are sort of back and forthing a bit on whether this is appropriate. And then we throw the question out to the students and let them discuss. In the second case study with the drain, we're asking for a more specific answer, and there may be more a feeling of resolution for students there. In a similar manner, I might offer some other work. This is a photograph by Justine Curlin titled The Wall, which I think is interesting since the other artist is Jeff Wall. Very similar in theme, but here we see young women past the start of puberty who exhibit authority. They have been described as feral teens living in moody, thrill-seeking packs at the gorgeous outskirts of civilization. Another beautiful work. They're both amazing works of art, but this one we can see has a completely different feel to it, that the approaching adulthood, I'm in control of my world, is very different than the tentative, fearful one that, was exhibited by the attitude that was exhibited by the younger girl in the drain. Case studies also teach students that unlike the narrow narratives strategically promoted by media that ask for people to take one of two sides on an issue or adopt an us versus them attitude, real life is messy, in which discourses are not easy nor easily resolved. Rather, they are layered with conflicting fields of sense, and people may not necessarily share goals, priorities, or values. In the classroom, we want to support this. We want to diminish polarized views about issues that ultimately manifests in individuals' diverging attitudes about issues and disaffection towards perceived outgroups, replacing it with an acceptance of viewpoint diversity and the validity of diverse opinions on a matter. Now, of course, I believe, and I could add to this, that all of this helps support belief change, that students are breaking out of their little bubble by the nature of the case study, the nature of the group dynamic, into a place where they begin to have more empathy for divergent opinions. A few final thoughts. There is a large body of research that suggests project-based learning and inquiry-based learning, case study falls right into that, are powerful and effective models for fostering deep understanding among students. The same could be said about case studies as inquiry-based learning, and that's certainly the way I frame it. Clearly, using case studies requires instructor preparation and often student preparation. So if we look at Sandel, and I have this in the appendix, who did lectures on ethics at Harvard University, we see students have substantially read sort of long case studies and have come prepared for that back and forth that goes on in a large group format. Those are not small group, it's with hundreds of students and one instructor back and forth. So another way it can be done. The ongoing challenge here is to figure out how we can shift a lot of what we bring into the classroom as content and shift it, turn it into a case study so students begin to figure this out on their own without the teacher being so involved. Case studies often are more open-ended, or sometimes, as in the second one here, ask for a more specific answer. So we can use it for both those in a classroom. We can leave it open-ended or say, okay, I'm looking for this sort of answer. And students will typically find it if we frame it correctly and ask the right prompting questions. It's fairly rare in my experience that students are going to go way off base and come up with something that's completely wrong. The inquiry method seeks to foster subject matter understanding and impart disciplinary means and processes. An inquiry question becomes a critical question if it requires students to make a reasoned judgment among options, use criteria to make that judgment, and connect outcomes to the curriculum. Finally, in my classes, I often structure an essential question with supporting case studies around what's called a through-line question. This is defined as a question that streams through the entire course and often helps students to organize content through a particular lens. For example, in an upper level painting class, I may look at art around the world and look at contemporary art, but I may also bring in this thing called accelerationism, which are philosophers and thinkers and artists who are looking at what they think is the speeding up of society in all forms, especially as it relates to hyper-commodification and capitalism. And so by streaming through and assigning readings about accelerationism across the whole course, it gives us a lens by which to look at art from around the world that is sort of accepting that or maybe trying to subvert that, etc. According to Den Heyer in 2009, a through-line notion seeks to interconnect program goals, objectives, and specific outcomes for lessons, units, and courses by asking relevant and provocative questions. These help students connect with the world they live in. I think one of the benefits of case studies as well as thought experiments is this idea of provocation, that students are very used today almost to say, let me look that up on Google, right? They do this all the time. I see it when we have a question in a discussion. I ask students to put their devices away. We can't look anything up. We can't reverse search the image. We can't look up something about who this artist is, etc. And I say, let's just try to figure this out on our own. But the great thing here is when it's provocative, it's pushing some buttons. It's asking people to look at themselves, to reflect on who they are, to think about what their opinion is. And then I push them a little farther saying, what's your strong opinion here? Is this right or is this wrong? And it's very easy for students to say, well, I don't know. And I push a little farther and say, well, think about it again. What do you think, right or wrong? And I'll just kind of like hammer on that until students sort of have to take a little bit of a position. I think that's a good thing in a provocative case study to help students figure out where they stand and if that makes sense. Finally, Albert Shanker, once president of the United Federation of Teachers in the United States, is said to have had a sign in his office that read, I taught it, but my students didn't learn it. Define teaching in this sentence. And one of the pedagogy courses I took with a really great instructor in New York City, she would quote this almost every class, and it totally stuck for me. And I quote it a lot too, because I think it's that important. One of the things a case study does is, because it situates the learning right in the lap of the students, they are doing the work, they are learning, they are putting 80–90% of the effort in, and it's meaningful, it's experiential learning in that sense. So today we've seen and experienced, albeit briefly, what I think is an effective method in which learning can be situated with the students that aligns with other aspects of pedagogical excellence, and which simultaneously supports inclusivity, viewpoint diversity, and hopefully belief change. Thank you very much. And if you have comments or questions, feel free to email me. I'll just point out I have appendices here that are key takeaways, references of work cited in this presentation, a sample narrative for the first case study, and then a section for more information. So again, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it.